This podcast is intended for investment professionals only. All investing involves risk.
Hello and welcome to another episode of In Conversation With. My guest today is Ben Cherrington, who has a career in finance spanning more than 2 decades. He started at Swedish investment giant Skandia before moving to what was then called New Star Asset Management, and then on to M&G Investments, where he was based for several years in their Singapore office, working with stakeholders across Asia. Ben joined Legal & General's asset management business in 2018 and was recently promoted to our head of UK Wholesale. Today, he's going to tell us what he learned from the people and places he's encountered in his career to date, focusing on how the industry has changed in that time and what the future might hold. Ben, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Harry. Pleasure to be here.
I'd like to start by asking you about what brought you to the investment industry in the first place. Were you one of those people who knew what you wanted to do from a really young age, or did chance play a part in your choice of career?
This is a bit of a strange reference, but people might get this. So I watched a movie when I was probably 12, 13 called Working Girl, if you know that title.
Oh, yes. Yeah, another one.
Yeah. If you remember, the opening sequence is a very sort of 80s power ballad. I think Let the River Run. It's a Staten Island ferry, Hudson River, Harrison Ford, Sigourney Weaver, Melanie Griffith. And if you remember, that movie was about investment banking, I think, and kind of mergers and acquisitions. And I don't know why, but it was just deeply aspirational for me. It really resonated. I'm from way back, a working class family. There were 7 of us living in quite a small house. I had no friends or family that I would regard as professionals per se. Certainly no friends or family that were in banking or investments. I don't think I'd been to London at that point, but really from that moment, I just got hooked. And from that moment, I kind of leant towards business studies, economics, finance at school, and then at college, and then at university, really, without really understanding the intricacies of what working in the city was, actually. Yeah, so I watched it earlier, the video to that song, and it's still got an impact. It still takes me back. So yeah, from about 13, 14. And if I think back to, so I did a degree which was 4 years, the third being a placement year at Bournemouth University. They had a really exceptional placement office, and I was actually offered 2 placement roles, one of which was Skandia, and we'll come on to talk about Skandia, I'm sure. I had no idea of their position in the market, but what I did know is that they were based in Southampton. My parents lived in Southampton. I went to university in Bournemouth, and by the 3rd year, I had no cash, none. And I had been working 3 jobs, really, for certainly the whole of the 2nd year, working at Debenhams in the day, working in a bar in the evening, and then actually going back to Debenhams at 11 o'clock at night to work, sort of walk the floor as a pseudo security guard.
Right.
So in addition to being offered the job at Skandia, I was offered a marketing role at Weller, who were based in Basingstoke, which actually isn't that far from Southampton. And Weller, for those that know, sort of hair products primarily, and for those that know me will find it absolutely hilarious, given I'm becoming a little bit follically challenged. The reason why I chose Skandia was simply I needed to get back on my feet financially. And if I'd taken the role in Basingstoke, I'd have had to continue to rent. And I was genuinely concerned that if I didn't try and save some money, the 4th year at university, which is the crucial year, the final year, would have been really difficult. So I chose Skandia. Now, that was really formative for me. I stumbled across some really, really smart people, management consultant grads, sort of more international people that I'd been exposed to before, some sort of ex-army sergeants that were now mutual fund sales. And I never looked back. I graduated and they invited me back. But I could it's sliding doors. I could very, very easily at that junction gone down the hair product route. And I've no idea where I'd be right now, but I'm guessing I wouldn't be on this podcast.
Amazing stuff, like you say, a real sliding doors moment there. When you were talking about your early years in a job can be so important for setting your path for the future, it made me think of a brilliant Martin Lewis anecdote that I remember hearing years ago about one of his first jobs where he had this task to frame the front pages of each day's newspaper and put them up in a little glass frame on the corridor. And he hated doing this admin chore, didn't see the point of it, until one of his colleagues pointed out that actually this is a really visible piece of work that all of the senior people in the company that he worked at the time would see as they walked along the corridor. And from that day onwards, he took great care of that little job. And I think he ended up being reasonably successful, in his career. Looking back on those early years at Scandia, were there any moments like that where a kind of little light bulb went off in your head and you thought, this matters, this is something that I need to do well?
I remember very, very, very vividly, for those that remember these days. So Scandia sponsored a very well-known sailing regatta called Cowes Week. So Cowes is the Isle of Wight, just beneath Southampton on the map. And back in those days, and we'll talk about this a bit later, corporate hospitality was featured highly in the industry. And I remember being in the Red Jet ferry queue to go over to Cowes for an evening at the regatta. And in that queue were about 20 fund salespeople from all of the asset managers in the city. And I was totally struck by how socially malleable they were, how impressive they were at holding court, how they could speak to anybody. They were absolute chameleons. They were full of energy, enthusiastic. And I think it was as much about, I think I knew at that very point I wanted to do that job.
So interesting. You can imagine someone else in that same queue being surrounded by these people with their savoir-faire who kind of seem to be able to adapt to the social situation, feeling intimidated, or like it would be difficult for them to adapt in that way. But clearly for you, it struck a chord and you were able to do it. Really fascinating stuff. So if I can move forward in time a bit to the time that you left Scandia, I believe that was around the time that it was acquired by Old Mutual. Did the prospect of that change of ownership play a part in your decision to find a new position?
I'd love to say I was wise enough, mature enough at that age for that to factor. Simply, I was poached. I was,
okay.
as I mentioned, Scandia was such, at that point in time, platforms were fundamental to the kind of mutual funds ecosystem. They, really did drive sales. And Scandia in particular was one of the biggest platforms at the time, so heavily courted by all asset managers. And if you were on the inside, and if you knew those companies very well, you were very attractive to asset managers. Now, care had to be taken in poaching people from clients. That's always a little bit delicate, but New Star approached me. And for those that remember New Star, as a 22 or 23-year-old, I was an immensely attractive prospect. So I was probably too young, too junior to be ultimately disrupted by Old Mutual buying Scandia. That probably would have happened at the more senior hierarchies. But New Star was what an experience. Anything anybody's ever read about New Star was invariably true. They were a high octane sort of hyper boutique at the height of the attraction of asset management boutiques. And I remember my first day, somebody sort of took me to the windows. They were based on Knightsbridge Green, Brompton Road. And the marketing director, very charming man. They were all very charming, but sort of walked me to the window and pointed out the window and said, "Oh, there's your corner shop," and it was Harrods. So, based on how seduced I was by Working Girl, you can imagine how seduced I was by having Harrods as my corner shop. So, yeah, I was I was very lucky that the head of UK Strat Partnerships at the time for New Star was a mentor, a friend, a brilliant salesperson, and it was a very easy decision to make to leave Scandia at that point. As much as I love Scandia.
So looking at the different roles you've had, Scandia and then New Star Asset Management, I can see that maybe not surprisingly change emerges as a recurrent theme, companies being bought, their strategies shifting. I believe you also saw some big changes in the time that you were at M&G. What sort of challenges do these big changes at organisations create in your experience? And does the fact that you've experienced change like that several times over your career see them differently, see the opportunities that might be thrown up in a different light?
Yeah, I honestly, I was terrible at dealing with change when I was younger. in my career. And I remember, these sort of leadership courses that you go on and 360s, and it was always called out actually as being a weakness in inverted commas. And I think it's very difficult when you start your career to be anything other than emotional in reaction to quite high levels of structural change. But the more you go through, the more you chill, if that doesn't make me sound a little bit odd as a 44-year-old saying that word. The reality is you should control the controllables. You need to try and get through that grief stage very quickly. Breathe, count to 10, all of those really patronizing things that you hear from somebody that's gone through it, but you haven't gone through it yourself. And also like 10, 15 years ago, I witnessed some sort of Etch-a-Sketch style team wipeouts, right? It was a little bit more brutal back then, and you just don't see that as much.
Okay, I'd like to ask you next about the time that you spent in Singapore. This is while you were at M&G. What were the biggest differences just day to day that you found between working in London and working in Singapore? And did that experience of working with international colleagues and clients shape your approach to work in subsequent roles?
There are so many differences. But I think those differences are as much about the differences between sort of UK strat partnerships, UK IFA land, versus sort of private banking, wealth management arena. I think that's as relevant here as London versus Singapore. I worked across the UK primarily with platforms and UK advisors. I went to Singapore and Hong Kong, and primarily our clients were private bankers. So the cut of the jib is very, very different, though there are obviously some nuances to doing business in Asian private banking hubs. So I guess the biggest one was the pace. I think that was a real adjustment. It's a very dynamic part of the world. If you see all of the Capgemini studies that show the growth in ultra high net worths and high net worths in Singapore and Hong Kong, if you see the way that banks are repositioning their central hubs away from Switzerland and the US towards Asia, the pace of growth there is very significant. And just the speed of doing business is quite a transactional part of the world. If you step back and look at it honestly, and you just have to service very quickly. Any private banker there will have, any ultra high net worth client there will have multiple private bankers. The private bankers are trying to service that client very quickly. They require information from asset managers very quickly, and you've just got this conveyor belt of urgency, which is a bit of a departure from the way the UK works, I'd say. So that was a real shock to the system and required a big adjustment. The investing culture in the private banking space in Asia is very different to certainly the UK advisor land. Again, more transactional investing. Timescales are shorter. Commissions from private banks often drive an element of churn. So, going over there and theorizing over portfolio theory and the importance of diversification and the importance of long-term holding, it doesn't really resonate as it does here, and that's fine. And actually, if you go over there and try to be holier than thou, it's abrasive. It's super abrasive. So again, you have to conform, you have to adhere. But to a London, well, actually, M&G is quite international, certainly now, but it's certainly at its heart is a very British institution. And just socializing those differences back to the mothership required a lot of time, internal stakeholder management. So that was a big one. I found, clients in the private banking space in Asia very technical. So it was absolutely crucial that you were mugged up, is the phrase that I kind of use. You have to yourself become very technical. You have a responsibility to know your products when you speak to very time-poor clients. But what are the passportable learnings? What are the key principles that now certainly have benefited me since, and kind of principles that I hold quite core to the way we run things here? One is respect that clients are time poor and be prepared. I think it's fair. You have a responsibility to add value to any conversation you're in. So never, find yourself in a car park looking at performance of your fund versus their holding, 5 minutes before the meeting. That's not the right thing to do. Activity is important. This is a people business, and seeing people. Now that's changed obviously post-COVID, but that is crucial. In Asia, if you stop seeing people, you stop selling units. So I've still got a bit of a hangover from that. Focus. So you can't be across 10 products. It's just not practical unless you've got some absolute superhuman salesperson. So realistically 3 or 4 products that you know inside out is max. So as a sales team, we're sort of going through the process of making sure the team understand what those 3 or 4 products should be, and then everybody has a responsibility to kind of own their knowledge on that.
Now that we've talked about your career history, let's get up to date. If I can ask 3 connected questions, if that's okay. First one is, what does your current role involve, just day to day? What are you spending your time doing, whether it's meeting people, looking at spreadsheets, whatever it is that you do day to day? The second part is, what do you enjoy most? Which parts of the job do you find most enjoyable? And finally, what do you think are the most important qualities that you need as an individual to be able to do your job well?
So I head up the UK Wholesale distribution team at LGIM, and we're responsible for the distribution of our range of funds across a variety of product wrappers. So, we have the UK domiciled stuff, unit trusts. We have the European domicile range, ICAVs, CCAVs. We obviously have real estate vehicles such as PAIFs, ETFs, and the more kind of bespoke solution seg mandate stuff. We naturally have a very broad range of investment credentials, equities, fixed income, index, real assets, multi-asset, of course. Now the team is divided into 3 pillars or 3 channels. So we have the wealth team that look after primarily the London gatekeepers for national wealth managers. We have a regional advisory team who look after kind of IFA land, and we have our wholesale alliances team who have a basket of very diverse client types, everything from rating agencies, risk raters, professional bodies, banks, building societies, D2C platforms, advisor platforms. So that one's interesting and crucial to the ecosystem of selling mutual funds in the UK. We've got approaching 20 people in that team if you combine salespeople with sales support. So, it's my job to build the strategy around, what we talk about and how we talk about that. It's my job to create a motivated and motivating team. Uniquely, actually, for the role, I do have clients. I think it's really important to be able to not just talk on behalf of your team in terms of feedback coming from clients. So I hold a small portfolio of very large clients. What do I enjoy about the job? Well, that's one of the pieces. I've always loved jousting with clients. I've always really enjoyed people. I find people really interesting, and I still get to do a lot of that. And it's quite important to me that I still get to do a lot of that. The other side that I enjoy, will come on to what highlights I've had in my career later, but I really enjoy building teams that are all pointing in the right direction, that are upbeat, enthusiastic, effective, and executing. And that is not easy to do. And actually, the team I ran in Asia was smaller than the team I run here. So getting 20 people pointing in the right direction is really difficult, actually. It's really difficult at any point in time, but in a very competitive market with some really big structural themes that can be quite disruptive, motivating 20 people is not easy, but it's a challenge. I like a challenge.
Looking back on your various jobs, does anyone stand out to you as having been a particularly important influence, or someone who was a role model for you?
So I count myself as incredibly lucky to start my career on the asset management side at a time when the industry was full of very impressive people. And I'd say some of the most prominent individuals across asset management distribution in the last 20 years, I was fortunate enough to work with at places like New Star. So, names that everybody will know: Phil Wagstaff, Greg Jones, Sam Metrick. These guys, I remember day one in New Star, in addition to Harrod's introduction, just sitting in this bank of desks on the sales floor, which was very loud and a buzz of energy, with these epic relationship managers around me. Yes, at that point in time, probably leant back on their chair with their feet up on the desks, throwing like scrunched pieces of papers into bins from across the office. But I was just overwhelmed with how sociable these individuals were. And we'll come on to the issues with the younger generation now. But I knew instantly what good looked like. And I think that's actually really difficult now for the generation coming through. So yeah, all of those mentioned were just really motivating and so open to mentoring. Again, any human being that crossed their path, they were just happy to talk to in a really loving, enthusiastic way. I was also always pretty into presenting. So I think I'd seen certain people present that I thought, okay, that I'd like to learn those skills. And there are people like Ned Cazalet, once upon a time, who from memory was sort of a pension or tax specialist on the circuit. Justin Urquhart-Stewart, who was 7IM, again, constantly on Radio 5 Live, Radio 4. I saw him presented alongside him actually at lots and lots of Zurich events. A chap called Neil Carter, who used to work at Jupiter, and I thought, my goodness, these people are good. And I've always been drawn to good orators, politicians, TED Talks. So yeah, they've always framed the way I like to communicate. And then I guess the one final person is a very, very well-known person in the industry. I'll be formal and call him by the name his mother would call him, Jonathan Wilcox, a Joffy. Everybody knows him as Joffy. And Joffy was the global head of distribution at M&G. And he was the one who took a risk on me.
So it sounds like you'll have no trouble with the first part of this next question. If you had to nominate one highlight from your career and one low light as well, if you're able to, what would you pick and why?
So I'm going to take liberties and probably do 1.5 of both, if that's okay. So the highlight was the build in Asia. It's an immensely difficult part of the world to succeed. It's a very transient part of the world, and staff turnover is very, very high. So to maintain a team of successful distribution individuals is very, very difficult, but we did it. The second one is an individual that was in my team until she went off on Mat Cover recently, actually, Catherine, who a rising star and a future leader at LGIM. And we, like many asset managers, signed up to the PFS roadshow, 26 venues, 3,000 delegates. This is high profile stuff. You build a presentation, you build a story together, and then we decided to divide those venues in half. So she was going to do 13. Now, she'd never presented to more than 5 people previous to that. And I'd say the smallest crowd she presented to across that roadshow was probably 60, 80 people. Now, I believe that people who want to get better the key to it is taking on feedback, constructive feedback, and having an appetite to develop and learn. And throughout the process leading up to the first venue, which was hers, we did lots of role plays, and she was just open to being much, much better. And I remember the first venue was East Midlands Airport, probably 120 people in the audience. And I could see she was a little bit nervous on the stand, and I kind of left her to her own devices, suggested she go outside. I could see she was still learning sort of the script in her head. So we go through, I sit at the back, standing room only, and she stepped up on stage and absolutely smashed it. And that is really rare to see. Like, people on their first time in front of that kind of audience, they survive. That's what they usually do. But within the process of getting her confidence, she developed a personal signature, which is, again, really rare. Like, day one, to have a swagger, to have a style, to have a personal signature is so rare. And I think after 3 or 4 minutes, I just sat back, and it was a personal drop the mic moment. Don't get me wrong, I'd say sort of 80% of her ability to do that was down to her and only 20 to me. But I was so proud. And actually, we held a bit of a competition between the two of us across those 13 venues each, who would score the highest. And she outscored me. So it felt very much like handing the baton to somebody who will go really, really far in this industry. And not many people can do that. So kudos to her. The low lights, Asia was tough. Really, really, really tough. I'd say the first 18 months of being there, away from friends, away from family, needing to get very technical very quickly every weekend, having worked Monday through Friday, to be prepared for very demanding technical clients required a lot of resilience.
I thought it was really interesting earlier on when you mentioned the role that your uni work placement had in you getting into this industry. What advice would you have for them? And what do you do, your current team at LGIM, in terms of mentoring and development to try to support the young members of your team to do their best?
Yeah, so that's a work in progress, because it is so, so tough. So I guess if I look back at how I learnt and the dynamics in the market when, 15, 20 years ago, it was so different to today. So if you look back, our ecosystem was dominated by platforms. You would sign up to partnership programs at platforms, which would give you access to programs of seminars and conferences across the country, where you as a salesperson would be presenting to up to 1,000 people a week when you stand up in front of 200 people and then you get off stage, your ability to build relationships with those individuals, if you've presented well, is easy, because there is just a human respect for that ability, that skill. So you've proved yourself, and with 25 minutes on stage, presenting well, you've proved yourself. You can go into any of those offices and pick up relationships. Now, April through to September was all about corporate hospitality. You can see why the FCA weren't overly impressed with this. But sailing regattas, golf days, horse racing, you name it. And again, like when you spend a whole day with a bunch of clients, it's very easy to build personal relationships that don't feel like a transaction, don't feel like you're selling to people. You went into an office which was full and surrounded by lots of other salespeople. Being completely frank, margins were higher, comp was higher. We were in a staff fund manager regime where it was quite easy to sell personalities. You didn't need to talk about resource and teams wrapped around some really big staff fund managers. And it was all supported by really visible above the line advertising. So you come into London on the M4 and you see a billboard advertisement for new style property, right? So all of those things together actually make being a salesperson quite easy. So if you think about that in the context of today, it's totally different. So platforms no longer provide you with a route to market. It's an operational relationship, it's a transactional relationship. So none of those partnerships programs provide, they're no longer a catalyst for a salesperson to engage with the underlying advisory universe. In seminars and conferences, nobody wants to hear from salespeople anymore. It's all about product specialists and fund managers. You are the chaperone, or you do a 30-second intro, or you whisk them to the next meeting, right? And no IFA in the room is going to respect you for that and automatically invite you into their business because of that. So, that segue is no longer there. I'd say that corporate hospitality is banned, putting it frank, so it's these guys can't rely on the social stuff to build relationships. That's super tricky. We now live in a world where it's hybrid. So 2 days a week, I'd say our teams are in, but they can't sit in the middle of an office and learn through osmosis or see what best practice is. That's really difficult. Margins are tighter, comp is lower. There's been a professionalization of the industry. So staff fund managers is not enough. So all of these things combined mean that it's a totally different space. So building relationships is tough. I'd say showcasing best practice is tough. Standing out is really, really tough. Being differentiated is really, really tough. So I guess in the conversations that I've had with our less experienced individuals, my advice has been be vocal, be visible. And if you can be kind of surprising and memorable in everything you do, you will be noticed. But I think every single asset manager out there is struggling with how you mentor in an environment that's totally unique to now versus the last 15 years.
Okay, so day to day, what do you do to try to maintain a healthy work-life balance? What do you like to do to unwind?
I am a workaholic, and I'm totally fine with that. I've always been that way. I believe it's somewhat responsible for where I am now. But like in terms of non-work, pure escapism, it's my doorstep, actually. For anybody that have children, you can't be anything other than present when you're chasing a 6-year-old around soft play or drawing a lizard for her to colour in. And I've in my life, I've tried to find lots of things where I can be mindful or meditative. But with her, I'm absolutely 100% present, because if I'm not, she completely calls me out.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for your time today. I feel like I've learned a huge amount about your world, what it's like today, what it was like yesterday, the huge changes. So thank you for your time today.
Pleasure, Harry. Thank you.
And thank you to our listeners at home as well.
As a reminder, this podcast is intended for investment professionals only and shouldn't be shared with a non-professional audience. The views expressed in this podcast are those of Legal and General Investment Management Limited, as at the date of publication. This podcast is for information purposes only, and we are not soliciting any action based on it. The information discusses general economic, market or political issues and/or industry or sector trends. It does not constitute research or investment, legal or tax advice. It is not an offer or recommendation or advertisement to buy or sell securities or pursue a particular investment strategy. Assumptions, opinions, and estimates are provided for illustrative purposes only. There is no guarantee that any forecast made will come to pass. No party shall have any right of action against Legal & General in relation to the accuracy or completeness of the information contained in this podcast. Where this document contains third-party information, the accuracy and completeness of such information cannot be guaranteed, and we accept no responsibility or liability in respect of such information, not for distribution to any person resident in any jurisdiction where such distribution would be contrary to local law or regulation. Copyright 2024. Legal & General Investment Management Limited is authorised and regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority. In Hong Kong, this material is issued by Legal & General Investment Management Asia Limited, regulated by the Hong Kong Securities and Futures Commission. For full terms and conditions, please visit our website. To find more content, you can check us out on X, formerly known as Twitter, LinkedIn, and our website.